1. Ukrainian paratroopers destroy Russia's most advanced tank. During a press conference at the Kyiv Press Center on Sunday morning, April 16, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said that fighting was taking place in Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka. Bakhmut and Marinka remain the focus of military activities. During the day, Ukrainian defenders repelled 40 Russian attacks. According to the report, the Russian military carried out 19 airstrikes, 4 missile strikes and more than 15 mass-launch missile system attacks on Ukrainian military positions and civilian infrastructure. Residential settlements during the day. Deputy Minister Hanna Maliar said that at the Lyman front, the 122nd Battalion of the 81st Airborne Brigade destroyed Russia's latest T-90 main battle tank. It is one of the increasingly rare Russian T-90 tanks. From 1992 until just before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia produced about 1,000 T-90s in various variants. After selling to a number of countries, mainly India, Russia has about 350 T-90A, about 100 T-90M and 200 old T-90. After 14 months of fighting, Russia ran out of T-90 tanks to the extent that it was not enough to march on Victory Day on May 9 this year. The fact that Russia has to take out of its inventory 60-year-old tanks like the T-62s also shows the loss of Russian tanks. Deputy Minister Hanna Maliar said Ukrainian troops destroyed or captured 3,653 Russian tanks. She emphasized that it is increasingly difficult to meet T-90s on the Ukrainian battlefield. In addition to the T-90 tank, the 122nd Airborne Battalion also destroyed decommissioned enemy infantry fighting armored vehicles, as well as an artillery trailer. In the past 24 hours, 460 Russian soldiers have been eliminated from the battle along with 3 tanks, 4 armored vehicles, an artillery system. Overall, from February 24, 2022 to April 16, the Ukrainian Self-Defense Forces eliminated about 181,550 Russian soldiers from the battle. The Ukrainian Defense Forces also destroyed or captured at the front 3,653 Russian main battle tanks, 7,073 armored vehicles, 2,785 artillery systems and 535 multiple launch rocket systems. The enemy also lost 283 air defense combat systems, 307 combat aircraft, 293 helicopters, 2,339 tactical drones, 911 cruise missiles, 18 warships, 5,646 troop and fuel vehicles, and 324 dedicated devices. 2. Report shows that a fire broke out at the Russian tank training center after large explosions. Newsweek had a report titled "A Fire Breaks Out at Russian Tank Training Ground After Explosions," reports, which means reports indicate a fire broke out at a Russian tank training center after massive explosions. Local media reported that a fire broke out at a Russian tank training ground following reports of explosions in the city of Kazan. On Saturday, explosions were heard in the southern part of Kazan, a city of more than 1 million people located about 447 miles east of Moscow, according to Kyiv Independent, an English-language Ukrainian news agency. Explosions were heard near a site used for tank training amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's special military operation was ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin last February. The Russian leader initially hoped for a quick victory over Ukraine, but after more than a year of fighting, Russia continues to struggle to make small gains. Now, Ukraine appears to be preparing for a potential spring counterattack in an attempt to regain more of the invaded territories. Details of the fire in Kazan remained scant as of Saturday afternoon. Russian officials did not specify a possible cause of the fire, nor did they disclose whether anyone was injured or killed in the fire. According to local media in Kazan, Russian officials have denied that they have received reports of a very large fire despite media reports and video footage. According to the Russian news agency, residents used Telegram to report the explosion, which was described as followed by very loud bangs. One resident wrote that the explosions are believed to have rocked their neighborhood. Video showing a column of smoke in Kazan appeared on social media on Sunday morning local time. Belarusian news agency Nexta reported, residents of #Kazan are reporting a powerful explosion near the tank training center. As usual, the local government denied everything. Local authorities said in October that some residents ordered to fight in Ukraine had been sent to Kazan following Putin's announcement of partial mobilization of the army. The order came in the wake of Ukraine's counteroffensive in late summer 2022, which saw Ukrainian troops recapture thousands of square miles of invaded territory. While the cause has not been determined in the latest fire, several fires have broken out in Russia since the start of the Ukraine war. Last month, a fire broke out at a plant that produces equipment, including Topol-M nuclear missile launchers, for the Russian military. Local authorities said 7 people were rescued from the building. Earlier that week, an anti-Putin partisan movement called the Black Bridge claimed responsibility for a fire at a building used by Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB for short, in the southern city of Rostov-on-Don near the Ukrainian border. At least 4 people were killed and 5 were injured in the fire. And last December, a military site near the Kremlin in Moscow also caught fire. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Foreign Ministry for comment via email. 3. Danish Leopard 1 tank will soon be sent to Ukraine. The first Danish Leopard 1 main battle tanks will soon be ready to be sent to Ukraine. Denmark's acting defense minister Troels Lund Poulsen visited Flensburger Fahrzeugbauggesellschaft, or FFG for short, along with members of the Defense Committee and the Foreign Policy Council. I am pleased to be able to invite congressional politicians to visit the FFG, so that they too can see how far we have come in the refurbishment of the Leopard 1 tank. We hope to be able to send them soon to Ukraine, Mr. Poulsen said. As a reminder, the Danish government has cooperated with Germany and the Netherlands to donate at least 100 Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine. Acting Danish Defense Minister Troels Lund Poulsen previously announced that the first batch of Leopard 1 tanks will be delivered to Ukraine in the spring of 2023. Fourth, Putin approved a new system that makes it harder for Russians to evade military calls. Evading the draft became more difficult in Russia. The new system will send a call for enlistment to a government portal called Goza Slugi. When a summons appears in this portal, it will be considered sent. Previously, a call to enlistment was only considered valid when it was hand-delivered and signed. The law also allows prosecution of any conscripts who ignore an online summons after a week, are barred from leaving Russia and have their assets frozen. During a partial Russian mobilization last September, the men evaded the draft by leaving their registered address, not signing the draft letter and warning their family and colleagues to do so. Same thing with them. When Russia's parliament passed legislation making the country's enlistment program more effective and harder to evade on Wednesday, it raised fears that many citizens could soon be called up to fight in the country. Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Kremlin describes the law as a streamlining of Russia's biennial military enlistment process. But CNN spoke to several Russians, who rejected the Kremlin's reassurances and said the move lays the groundwork for another attempt to force Russians into the battlefield in Ukraine. Alexei, a 41-year-old lawyer from Moscow, told CNN, "I don't believe a word of this." Although he is not of the age to be officially mobilized, he assumes that the Kremlin will not follow its own instructions when it comes to calling new recruits. "It will be much easier to mobilize me now as digital life in Moscow has become so pervasive. This could be an attempt to avoid the need to do the full-scale manhunts they did before, which caused a lot of panic," said a 25-year-old Russian named Artem. He avoided mobilization in September despite receiving a call to enlist by moving out of residence. 5. Zelensky discusses Macron's recent visit to China in a call with the French president. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and French President Emmanuel Macron had a phone conversation lasting an hour and a half on Saturday, President Zelensky said in his address to his compatriots on Saturday evening. Zelensky said that the outcome of President Macron's recent visit to China was discussed, and that he praises France's intention to further strengthen vital support to Ukraine on the battlefield. Macron said he told Xi Jinping earlier this month that he was counting on him to argument with Russia and help end the war in Ukraine. China has declared neutrality in the conflict and tried to frame itself as a peace agent. But they have refused to condemn the Russian invasion and have continued to tighten economic and diplomatic ties with the Kremlin over the past year, including Mr. Xi's state visit to Moscow last month. 6. How Ukraine can coerce Putin with a blockade of Crimea. Newsweek has an article titled "How Ukraine Can Force Putin's Hand with a Crimea Blockade," which means how Ukraine can force Putin with a blockade of Crimea. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through the presentation of Kim Thuy. The blockade of Crimea by Ukrainian forces from Russia could affect resources and force Vladimir Putin to change his wartime strategy, a former U.S. ambassador told Newsweek. Russian military units located along the 800-mile front are said to have been preparing for a spring Ukrainian counterattack in the eastern Donetsk region for months. Tamila Tasheva, the top representative of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Crimea, said recently that the anxiety of Russian citizens in the region is palpable and evident by the thousands of people fleeing Crimea and giving up their lives, their property for safety reasons. Ukraine's purported counterattack could come after Putin and Russia cancelled the annual Victory Day celebrations on May 9 in regions including Crimea, Kursk, and Belgorod. William Courtney, an adjunct senior fellow at the nonpartisan RAND Corporation and former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, wrote in a recent editorial published by the Moscow Times that a meeting and eventual blockade may be a better long-term strategy for Ukraine than trying to completely bypass territory annexed by Russia in 2014. Courtney told Newsweek in a phone conversation that Crimea's importance in the ongoing conflict was due to its annexation nearly 9 years ago, along with Putin's nuclear threats. It led to proposals for a blockade supported by modern technologies, centered on the Black Sea. If it's blocked off, that basically means the Russians can't use Sevastopol as a naval base, he said, adding that warships in the Black Sea cannot harass navigation. Ukraine. This is going to have a pretty powerful impact. A blockade could also force Putin and his military to reanalyze their strategy and inflict more damage in other ways, such as part of a more widespread use of weapons. Air defense gas. The Ukrainians were also able to carry out more powerful attacks elsewhere. He expressed particular focus on the Kerch Bridge, which has previously been the target of Ukrainian forces because it connects Russia to Crimea and negatively affects logistics. He added that it would also affect Russian warships in the Black Sea. That not only disables most, if not all, of Russia's military capabilities in Crimea, but also undermines military support for the Russian military starting in Kherson and the Zaporizhia region. Courtney said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has basically said that a solution to this war will not happen unless Ukraine successfully recaptures Crimea. Courtney said a ceasefire or armistice does not require a political agreement and essentially means an agreement whereby two nations stop fighting. Meanwhile, a political settlement would likely require Ukraine to cede the Crimean territory that it has been so adamant about reclaiming. I don't think there is any possibility of a political settlement, he said. Ukrainians will absolutely oppose that, and the West will certainly not pressure Ukraine to cede this territory. Courtney said the truce could come into effect if Ukraine took other territories important to Russia and Crimea was the one left to take, but he declined to predict what might happen due to the lack of space. Predictability of the war and the conflict that has dragged on for more than 13 months. However, he expects continued support from the NATO allies. The West will continue to support Ukraine as it is a clear example of naked belligerence, and compare this to strong Western reactions in Korea and during the Cold War, he said. Andriy Zagorodnyuk, who served as Ukraine's defense minister from 2019 to 2020 and is now an advisor to Zelensky's government, previously told Newsweek that Russian construction activity in Crimea was not surprising. Of course, the Russians are trying to fortify, but I don't think it will work, simply because this is not the beginning of the 20th century and physical fortifications cannot guarantee that a force will be able to hold on. Location, said Zagorodnyuk. They will be attacked from the air with missile attacks, airstrikes, etc. He also stated that Crimea's invincibility is overestimated by international observers. Hilary Appel, a professor of government at Claremont McKenna Institute in Claremont, California, told Newsweek via email that it would be very difficult if almost impossible for Ukrainian forces to succeed in Crimea by military force alone. She agrees that the Kerch Bridge could be an important military success for Ukraine. Putting Russia out of Crimea in the current context could mean taking control of the base in Sevastopol, Appel said. Although Ukraine was previously willing to accept Russian control of the base and the Black Sea Fleet stationed there on its territory, the invasion changed that. The Ukrainian leadership does not want any Russian troops stationed on their territory at the moment. 7. Emergency workers struggle to save Sloviansk survivors. Tatiana's eyes are fixed on emergency workers digging through rubble in what was once the top floor of an apartment building in the city of Sloviansk, eastern Ukraine. On Friday afternoon, 7 Russian S-300 missiles hit her community, with the 8th hitting the nearby town of Kramatorsk. Local authorities said 11 people were killed, including a toddler, and more than 20 were injured. The child that was killed was only 2 years old, Tatiana told CNN, tears rolling down her cheeks. The baby's father is still trapped in the rubble, she said, pointing to the building. If the paramedics could lift the cement slabs, they could save him. It's cold, and he's been there for almost 24 hours, interjected a man standing next to her. The father and son were members of a family that fled Sloviansk during the early part of the war. Like many others, they recently turned back after Russian forces were repelled in the Ukrainian counteroffensive last fall. The rocket hit the building directly, throwing debris across the surrounding area. I know everyone who died, said Lilia, who has lived in the adjoining apartment complex since 1977. Awful. Military officials and rescue firefighters are doing their best to save people after a rocket attack in Sloviansk, Ukraine, on April 14, which is Orthodox Good Friday. Sloviansk Mayor Vadim Lyak announced on Saturday that a free train service will begin on Tuesday, giving residents the opportunity to move to safer areas in the Donetsk region, as well as accommodation, meals and social welfare. In a statement, the mayor noted that the town's current population is 50,000, up from 20,000 last summer. In another part of Sloviansk, a crater marked the missile's impact point in the middle of a children's playground. It was raining and cold on Friday, so the playground was empty when the rockets hit, otherwise many people would have died because this park is usually crowded. A total of 75 tons of rubble was removed at the site, the emergency services report said. According to Sloviansk Mayor Vadim Lyak, at least 8 explosions rocked the city on Friday afternoon local time, when Russian forces attacked the city with S-300 missiles. The attacks hit apartment buildings, residences, administrative buildings and school grounds. 8. U.S. Secretary of State says intelligence leaks have no effect on cooperation with allies and partners. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says recent U.S. intelligence leaks, including sensitive information about the war in Ukraine, does not affect cooperation with allies and security partnerships. Blinken commented on Saturday's leak during a trip to Vietnam. We have been talking to our allies and partners since these leaks emerged, and we have done so at a high level, and we have made clear our commitment to protecting information intelligence as well as our commitment to our security partnerships, Blinken said while speaking at the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi. What I've heard so far, at least, is an appreciation for the steps we're taking and that doesn't affect our cooperation, Blinken told reporters. Some context: on Thursday, the FBI arrested 21-year-old National Air Force member Jack Teixeira in connection with the leak of classified U.S. documents. He was charged on Friday with unlawful storage and transmission of national defense information, as well as unauthorized theft of classified information and defense documents. CNN reviewed several documents that revealed sensitive information about key weaknesses in Ukraine's defenses, the extent to which the U.S. infiltrated the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian mercenary organization Wagner Group, and the extent to which the U.S. monitor against opponents and allies, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A source close to Zelensky told CNN that some of Ukraine's military plans have been altered as a result of the leak. 9. Former diplomat commented, Ukraine has a non-violent option to occupy Crimea. Newsweek ran an article titled Ukraine has non-violent option to capture Crimea, former diplomat, which means Ukraine has a non-violent choice to take Crimea, former diplomat. We invite you and your brothers and sisters to follow the translation into Vietnamese through Thuy Con's presentation. According to a former U.S. diplomat, Ukraine's blockade of Crimea rather than trying to capture the territory with military strikes is a better option because both countries have the ability to launch new attacks. Crimea has been at the center of tension between both countries since it was annexed by Russia in 2014. Since then, Russia has occupied 4 more territories, Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia, in Ukraine since the most recent invasion on February 24, 2022. These latest annexations have been declared illegal by Ukraine and its allies in the West. Last month, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine 9 years ago was out of the question because he and other top Russian officials think any upheaval in the region is possible. Resolved completely peacefully. In an editorial published April 8 in the Moscow Times, an independent online publication in English and Russian based in Amsterdam, co-authors William Courtney and Scott Savitz of the nonpartisan organization RAND Corporation wrote that restoring the peninsula linked to Ukraine by a militarily narrow isthmus is a difficult prospect as Russian forces can fortify it at will. Courtney, a former ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, and Savitz, an engineer, said, however, Ukraine did not need to push the invading forces out of Crimea. Allow Ukraine to blockade and prevent Russian activities. They cited an appeal by retired U.S. Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges to Kiev's forces to isolate Crimea with long-range precision strikes. Drive the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol with daily precision strikes, and do the same for the Russian Air Force at Sakei etc., Hodges tweeted in February, adding, preventing drone launch units from sheltering there, and then considering the deployment of ground forces. The neutralization of Russian forces by Ukraine could also include the use of explosives-laden drones, which are low-cost options for swarm attacks against Russian warships based in Ukraine. Sevastopol. The concept is simple: low-profile, camera-packed, explosive-filled unmanned boats headed for targets, they write. This emerging technology can sink warships and destroy maritime infrastructure. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken out about his country's intention to retake Crimea. This war, which began with Russia's invasion of our Crimea, with its attempt to capture Donbass, must end precisely there, in the liberated Crimea, in the liberated Donbass cities, with the army ours to the Ukrainian national border, Zelensky said in August after a Ukrainian counterattack in Kherson. We always keep this goal in mind. We have not forgotten that. Zelensky has repeated claims in the months since, including that Kyiv could never escape the threat of Russian invasion if Crimea belonged to the Kremlin. U.S. Foreign Policy Council President Herman Kirchner, who has visited post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine, more than 70 times, told Newsweek after his visit in January that he had a feeling that Crimea is something that can be usurped easily by Ukrainian forces. The blockade could be part of a successful strategy to bring Crimea back to Ukraine, Mikhail Alexeyev, a political science professor at the University of San Diego, told Newsweek via email, but it depends on the level of support. Military aid that Ukraine receives from the international community. There are many other variables at play, he said. A lot will also depend on the outcome of battles elsewhere in Ukraine. A string of major Russian military failures could quickly change expectations and lead to a series of defections and retreats. We have seen the exodus of residents from Crimea after successful attacks on the Crimean Bridge and several Russian military facilities there. He added, at this point, it is important to emphasize that Crimea is part of Ukraine and that the many options for liberating this area are reasonable and actionable. Many scenarios that previously seemed impossible are quickly becoming possible. The annexation of Crimea was initially praised, with a poll conducted at the time showing 9 in 10 Russians in favor. An independent survey conducted in 2021 found that 86% of respondents supported the merger while 71% of them did not consider it illegal, according to the Moscow Times. Newsweek has reached out to Courtney by phone and email for comment.